In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at ProRes Raw on the Sony A7S Mark III and comparing it to some of the other internal 10-bit codecs that you can record with the A7S III. To be clear, I think that all of these recording formats are great, but there are some strengths and weaknesses with each of these codecs, and my hope is that by the end of this video, you'll be able to select with confidence which one is right for your next project. For those of you that are new around here, my name is Riley, and I'm a documentary filmmaker that likes talking about everything from filmmaking and creativity to faith. I'm also someone that likes to shoot on Sony cameras. So if any of that interests you, I would love it if you would consider subscribing and following along. All right, let's dive in. The first codec that we're going to take a look at is the XAVC Siii Codec. Now, this is a new codec to the A7S Mark III, and the I in SI stands for intra-frame. Now, this means that the camera is actually going to record every single frame in the image. This is going to be the least taxing on your computer's processor for editing, and it's also going to allow for the least amount of compression. It comes in at 240 megabits per second for a 24 frames per second image, and in my opinion, it has the best image quality for all of the internal codecs. So to me, this one's going to stack up the closest to the ProRes Raw image. Let's take a look at color grading these two side by side. All right, so I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison with ProRes Raw and XAVC Siii in Final Cut, and this is just my editor of choice. All of these same principles apply in Premiere, and for the most part, all of the same corrections can be done in Premiere as well. So everything should translate over to Premiere. This is just to show you guys a side-by-side comparison between these two codecs and how they hold up in a color grade. Now, right off the bat, I would say that they actually are pretty comparable. This is ProRes Raw, and this is XAVC Siii. I think the only difference that I'm really seeing is that ProRes Raw just has a little bit more richness, maybe a little bit more saturation in the colors, and I think this is pretty evident in the skin tones, for example. But honestly, the XAVC Siii codec is doing a fantastic job. There's no banding, there's no macro blocking, it's not really falling apart in any places, and I think if you're going to do a pretty standard, straightforward color grade, you are going to have great results with XAVC Siii. To show you guys what I've done, it's all pretty standard here. I did a color correction, a basic color correction for the white balance. I added a LUT. I played around with the curves a little bit, and then I just changed the hue on the water here. Now, for the most part, everything is going to hold up and perform really well in XAVC Siii. The big difference, obviously, is that with ProRes Raw, you can come over here and you can change the ISO pretty easily and conveniently. Whereas with XAVC Siii, you just don't have this ability. You certainly could try and make an adjustment with your wheels or your curves, and try to pull down the highlights or increase the shadows, but it's just not going to have the same effect that changing the ISO does in post. But really, I think the biggest difference between ProRes Raw and XAVC Siii is going to come in the fact that ProRes Raw is 12-bit. Now, let's say, for example, that you want to bring out the details here in the sky, in the clouds right here, just past the Space Needle. And let's say, for example, you decide to use a mask to do this. Now, this is where 12-bit color is going to make a difference, because by coming over here and adding a mask, we are going to add, we're going to put some strain on the color gradations. Now, obviously, this is a really bad color grade, but I'm making this example as sort of an extreme example to show you guys kind of the differences here. Now, if I zoom in on the clouds here, there really is not a a whole lot of banding. There's pretty smooth gradation. I don't know what you can see in YouTube. There might be some banding in YouTube, but here in my editor, blown up at 400%, there really is not a ton of banding. This like pretty crazy curve adjustment, which is not really something you would do in real life, really could be falling apart, but it's not. It's holding up pretty well, and that's really what we want to see, is that in the most extreme examples, it's going to hold up. And so if you do a lot of masking, if you do a lot of pretty extreme color grades, whatever you throw at this codec, it's going to handle for the most part. Now, if we jump over to XAVC SI with the exact same correction applied, and we zoom into that same 400%, again, I don't know what you can see on YouTube, but on my end here, there is actually some pretty significant banding that's taking place right here along the clouds. And this is just because this is a 10-bit codec versus a 12-bit codec. You can see over here, again, there is a decent amount of banding, and just kind of in this area where there's a subtle gradation, it's starting to fall apart. Now, again, this is a pretty extreme example. I'm never gonna have this crazy of a curve adjustment made in the corner of the image, but it just gives you an example of kind of how these two codecs hold up under some pretty extreme stress. The XAVC SI codec is an excellent choice, but the ProRes Raw codec is just going to give you that little bit of extra flexibility, and it's going to give you some extra control over your ISO and your noise reduction as well, assuming you're fine taking the time to handle that yourself in post. The next format that we're going to take a look at and compare to ProRes Raw is the XAVC S format. Now, this format at 24 frames per second is 100 megabits per second and is pretty standard across most Sony mirrorless cameras. Now, this format is a long GOP codec, which just means that it has a different compression method, and there's going to be some good things that come with this compression method and some bad things. We'll start with the good. The first is that it is a very small, relatively speaking, file size. At 100 megabits per second, you're going to be able to record for longer durations and have less cost in your storage for your hard drives and archives. Some of the cons for this recording format are that it's 100 megabits. So because it's smaller and more compressed, you might see some compression artifacts and macro blocking in some areas where you wouldn't expect to see them on some of the other codecs or in ProRes Raw. The other downside to this codec is created by the way that it saves space and compresses the image. And how it does this is that it will record a frame, it will skip several frames, and then it will record another frame. And then what happens is the in-between frames are actually created based on the images surrounding those frames. And so this is actually going to put more strain on your computer and your editing system, and it also can create some weird artifacts and weird funkiness if you have a lot of movement in your frame. So I think for an interview, this format is totally fine for most scenarios where you don't have a ton of movement. And I'm not talking about like a slow, subtle movement that happens in most frames. I'm talking about like a slow motion shot of dropping an apple like you see here. There is the potential to have some ghosting or weird artifacting going on because not every single frame is recorded individually. Now, I'll probably use ProRes Raw or the SI codec if I'm doing a bigger project or I know that I'm going to be spending a lot more time color grading or potentially delivering this to a client. But I think for a lot of scenarios like YouTube or potentially even things like weddings where you know that you're going to need to save on space because you're going to be recording for long periods of time, this is an excellent codec to consider using. Now let's compare XAVC S to ProRes Raw in a color grade. All right, so here is a side-by-side comparison between ProRes Raw and XAVC S. And my big takeaway again is that XAVC S actually does a pretty fantastic job and is a great codec to use, especially if you need to save space. But there are a few small details and spots that I would like to point out where ProRes Raw does seem to excel over the XAVC S codec. Now let's first add our color grade. It's going to be a pretty basic one with some exposure and white balance adjustments. We'll add a LUT onto it, add some color curves. We'll add a mask to it. Here what I did is I just masked out the water, made this a little bit more green, and then made the yellow in the skies pop a little bit more. And then we'll add a little bit of a color shift onto the hue and saturation curves here. Now this is a pretty standard color grade. There isn't a ton of craziness going on. The mask honestly is probably the most complicated thing, but even this is a pretty basic one. It's just the bottom half of the screen. And as you can see, they match pretty well. These two side-by-side images hold up pretty well, and I think when you view them without really zooming in or pixel peeping on either one of them, they both look pretty good. But there are a couple spots where the XAVC S codec struggles over the ProRes Raw, and that's just going to be in some of these fine details here in the waves and kind of the spray of the ocean. Because there is a lot of movement in this frame, if you play it back, you'll see that the water is moving with these waves, and there are some pretty fine details in the waves with the water kind of splashing up. Now if I zoom in, this becomes even a little bit more apparent. Over here, this is the ProRes Raw side of the image, and you can see that each of these little droplets of water you can make it out, and there isn't a ton of banding or really any other artifacting going on over the water. The water stands out, the detail is pretty clear and crisp, and even over here it's the same thing, that the detail is pretty sharp, and you can definitely separate the water from the sky in the background. But if I move over to the XAVC S codec, you'll see that it just doesn't have quite the same level of detail. The water here and some of these droplets are a little bit blotchy. There's a tiny bit of artifacting going on up above the water here, and just kind of in between the spray of this water and the sky behind it, it just starts to get a little bit muddied. And you can kind of see this over here. Just kind of the edges of this wave are a little bit fringed and have some banding and artifacting in here. Again, my big takeaway is that these are both excellent codecs, but if you want the best image possible, ProRes Raw is probably the way to go. However, XAVC S definitely has some advantages in terms of file size and convenience when it comes to being able to record a lot on a small memory card and not needing an external monitor. The next format that's worth looking at is the XAVC HS codec. Now, this is a pretty popular codec because it's twice as efficient as the standard XAVC S codec. And what this means is that at 100 megabits per second for a 24 frames per second image, you're effectively getting 200 megabits per second worth of information. Now, if that sounds too good to be true, that's because, in my opinion, it is. It's still a long GOP codec and is going to suffer with all of the same drawbacks that the XAVC S codec has, except even worse. Because it's an H.265 codec, it is really hard to play back and edit smoothly on most computers. So for me, I have to transcode it into proxies to be able to even view it and play it back, and it's just not even worth it for me. It's still more compressed than the XAVC SI format, So for me, when I want the best quality codec, I think the clear winner there as far as internal codecs goes is the Siii Codec. Overall, my big takeaway with doing this video is that it's a great time to be a filmmaker using a tool like the A7S Mark III. It's pretty crazy that we have the choice and the option to be able to use RAW or a great internal 10-bit codec with this type of camera. I think for me personally, my preference is to always shoot ProRes Raw to be able to have the most control over the image. But there definitely are projects and times where the internal 10-bit codec is one that I'm going to pick over ProRes Raw. I think the hardest choice for me is going to be when I do the next documentary project overseas, whenever we're allowed to travel and that can happen again. And honestly, it might just come down to whether or not I want to use a monitor on top of the camera. I am definitely going to want to try and shoot those projects in ProRes Raw because the image is just so lovely. But I also know that if I want a smaller profile and I don't want to have that monitor, then the internal 10-bit codecs really are special as well. Be sure to let me know in the comments section below which recording formats you're shooting on and why. I'd love to know what types of projects you're creating and why the codec that you selected is best for that type of project. And as always, I would love it if you guys would hit the like button below as well as consider subscribing. It really is the best way to help me support this channel. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.